She wasn't supposed to be here tonight. The words echoed in Daniel Reed's mind as he stood under the crystal lights of the rooftop gala in downtown Chicago, glass of champagne untouched in his hand, while investors laughed around him, sealing deals worth millions. For 3 years, Olivia Carter had been nothing more than a quiet presence in the background of his life, someone who existed in the same house, but never in the same world. He remembered mornings where she waited at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold, while he checked emails without looking up. Nights where her voice softened in conversation, only to be answered with distracted nods. She had stopped asking for attention long before she stopped being seen. And yet tonight, the entire room shifted the moment she arrived. A black Rolls-Royce pulled up at the entrance, doors opening slowly as if the city itself was holding its breath. Olivia stepped out with calm precision, her posture different, her silence heavier, not empty, but intentional. Beside her stood Ethan Whitmore, a man whose name carried weight in every boardroom from New York to San Francisco, the kind of man Daniel had only ever seen across negotiation tables he wasn't invited to. Cameras turned. Conversations paused. Even the music seemed to soften for her arrival. Daniel felt a strange pressure in his chest as he watched her walk forward, not rushing, not searching, but already belonging. Someone nearby whispered Ethan's name, then hers, as if trying to connect dots that didn't fit the story they thought they knew. Daniel tried to step forward, to say something, anything, but the distance between them felt wider than the entire city skyline. Olivia didn't look his way, not once. Instead, she adjusted a simple bracelet on her wrist, a small, deliberate motion that somehow spoke louder than anything she could have said. Ethan leaned slightly toward her, speaking in a calm tone Daniel couldn't hear, but whatever was said made no difference to her expression. It wasn't pride. It wasn't anger. It was absence of need. Daniel stood frozen as Ethan's assistant announced a new partnership between Whitmore Group and a rising creative division led by Olivia Carter herself. The name hit like silence. Not because it was loud, but because it explained everything Daniel had failed to see for years. And as Olivia finally lifted her gaze across the room, it passed over him like a memory that no longer belonged to her present. Daniel Reed stood still as the announcement continued to echo through the rooftop gala. But his mind was no longer in the present moment. It had already fallen backward into fragments he had spent years ignoring. While guests around him tried to resume polite conversation, Daniel's eyes stayed locked on Olivia Carter, who now stood beside Ethan Whitmore as if she had always belonged there, not as someone borrowed into a new life, but as someone who had rebuilt herself into it. 3 years earlier, that version of Olivia had existed in silence inside a suburban home just outside Chicago, a place filled with expensive furniture and empty conversations. Daniel remembered mornings when he left before sunrise, coffee in hand, already thinking about markets in New York and calls in San Francisco, while Olivia moved quietly through the house, folding laundry, preparing meals, waiting for words that rarely came. At the time, he called it responsibility, building a future, providing stability, but now those memories felt like scenes he had never truly participated in. There was a moment he recalled with uncomfortable clarity, a Sunday afternoon when Olivia had asked if he wanted to walk with her around the neighborhood lake, just 20 minutes away, a simple request measured in ordinary time, but he had declined without looking up from his laptop. She had smiled anyway, but something in that smile had changed after that day, something Daniel had not understood then and only recognized now as distance forming in real time. Over the following months, she became quieter, not in sadness he could easily notice, but in resignation that required no explanation. She stopped asking questions about his schedule, stopped leaving reminders on the kitchen counter, stopped trying to pull him into the same room emotionally. Daniel told himself she was adapting, becoming independent, but what she was actually doing was disappearing from the version of the marriage he was actively present in. One evening, he came home later than usual, around 10 o'clock at night, only to find her sitting alone at the dining table with papers neatly arranged in front of her. She had looked up at him with a calm expression that did not match the weight of what she was about to say. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, only a decision presented with quiet certainty. She told him she was leaving, not because of anger, but because she no longer recognized herself in the life they were living. At the time, Daniel had thought it was temporary, a phase, something that could be fixed later after a business trip or a better schedule, but she had already reached a point where waiting had lost its meaning. Now, standing in the present, watching her next to Ethan Whitmore, Daniel understood something he had failed to see before. She had not been taken away from him that night she left. She had simply stopped waiting to be found. The silence on the rooftop gala did not last long, but for Daniel Reed it stretched like a slow fracture inside his chest as he watched Olivia Carter remain composed beside Ethan Whitmore, as if the entire world had rearranged itself around her without asking for permission. Guests began to circulate again, conversations restarting in careful tones, yet every movement felt staged to Daniel, as though reality itself had tilted slightly off balance. He tried to convince himself that this was still his world, the world of contracts, quarterly reports, and familiar names on conference calls. But every time his eyes returned to Olivia, that certainty weakened. She was no longer the woman who waited in quiet rooms or filled empty mornings with patient silence. There was something deliberate in the way she held herself now, a stillness that was not absence but control. Daniel remembered the early years of their marriage when she would ask him about his day, not out of obligation but genuine interest, and he would answer in fragments while checking messages, already halfway out of the conversation. He had believed that presence meant simply being in the same physical space, but now he understood that presence was something far more fragile, something that could vanish without warning when not nurtured. A memory surfaced of a winter evening when snow had fallen heavily outside their home, and Olivia had prepared dinner early, hoping he would return before midnight. He had arrived at 2 in the morning, exhausted, distracted, and she had still waited up, sitting under dim kitchen lighting with a book she never turned the pages of. He had apologized without looking at her face, assuming tomorrow would reset everything. But tomorrow had only repeated the same pattern in quieter ways. Standing here now, Daniel realized those patterns had not been harmless repetition, but gradual erosion. On the rooftop tonight, Ethan Whitmore leaned slightly toward Olivia as they spoke with a calm familiarity that did not need explanation, and Daniel noticed how naturally she responded, not with eagerness, but with ease, as if she no longer had to translate herself to be understood. A group of executives approached them, introducing themselves with rehearsed enthusiasm, and when Ethan mentioned Olivia's role as head of creative development for Whitmore Global Projects, Daniel felt a sharp, silent collapse of assumptions he had never questioned. He had known Ethan Whitmore by reputation only, a figure discussed in financial briefings and industry reports, someone whose decisions shaped markets across multiple states, from California to New York, yet he had never connected that world to the woman he once shared a kitchen with. Olivia listened as the executives spoke about expansion opportunities and upcoming partnerships, and when she finally answered, her voice carried a clarity Daniel did not recognize, not louder, not colder, but certain in a way that required no validation. For the first time that evening, Daniel understood that the distance between them was not measured in years or events, but in perception, in the way one person grows into their life while the other remains unaware they have already been left behind. The evening air on the rooftop had grown cooler, but Daniel Reed barely felt it as he remained fixed in place, watching Olivia Carter move through conversations as if she had never once belonged to the life he remembered. The gala continued around them, glasses clinking softly, polite laughter rising and falling like waves that no longer reached him. Every moment felt slightly delayed in his perception, as though he was observing a world that had already moved forward without waiting for his understanding. Olivia stood beside Ethan Whitmore, and there was a rhythm between them that Daniel could not decode, not intimacy, not familiarity in the way he once understood it, but something far more unsettling, a mutual alignment that required no explanation. Daniel noticed how people adjusted their tone when speaking to her now, how executives leaned in slightly, how introductions carried respect rather than curiosity. It was not just status that had changed, it was the way others now assumed she belonged at the center of decisions rather than the edge of them. A memory surfaced unexpectedly, of Olivia sitting alone at their kitchen island late at night, a small lamp illuminating papers she had been reviewing for a freelance design project she had never spoken about in detail. He had walked past her then, assuming it was a hobby, something temporary to fill her time while he focused on work that mattered. He remembered not asking questions, not because he was unkind, but because he believed there would always be more time to understand later. That belief now felt like a mistake that had quietly shaped everything that followed. Across the rooftop, Ethan Whitmore gestured toward a group of executives, and Olivia followed without hesitation, not behind him, not beneath him, but beside him in a way that suggested equality rather than dependence. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest as he realized how effortlessly she moved through this world, as if she had always been capable of it, but had simply never been given the space to step into it before. A junior executive approached Daniel with a polite greeting, but Daniel barely responded, his attention still anchored across the room. He heard fragments of conversation around him, words like acquisition, expansion, and partnership, but they felt disconnected from anything he could influence now. When Ethan introduced Olivia formally to a group of international investors, her name carried weight he had never associated with her before, not because it was louder, but because it was now attached to authority. Daniel recalled moments when she had asked for his opinion on ideas she was developing, small sketches on paper, concepts she had tried to share with him during quiet evenings. He had responded vaguely, distracted, promising to look at them later, but later had never come. Now those same instincts, those same ideas, seemed to have evolved into something far larger than anything he had ever taken time to notice. Olivia listened as the investors discussed global markets and creative direction, and when she spoke, her words were precise, measured, and free of hesitation, as though every sentence had already been considered long before it was spoken. Daniel realized then that nothing about her transformation had been sudden. It had been a gradual accumulation of moments he had not been present for, decisions he had not witnessed, growth he had not recognized. And as he stood there, surrounded by noise that no longer included him, he understood with unsettling clarity that the version of Olivia he once knew had not disappeared in a single moment, but had simply continued to evolve in a direction he had never followed. The conversation at the rooftop gala had shifted into a new rhythm, but Daniel Reed could no longer find his place inside it, as he watched Olivia Carter stand with a confidence that did not ask for permission from anyone in the room. Ethan Whitmore remained beside her, not as a shadow and not as a spotlight, but as a steady presence that seemed to reinforce everything she had become. Daniel noticed how Olivia no longer reacted to the attention around her. She simply received it, as if recognition was no longer something she needed to chase. A cluster of investors surrounded them, speaking in measured tones about global expansion strategies, and every word they used carried the weight of industries Daniel had spent years trying to access. Yet none of it seemed to surprise Olivia. She listened with calm focus, occasionally responding with brief, precise statements that guided the direction of the conversation rather than reacting to it. Daniel's mind drifted again, not forward but backward, to the years he had once considered stable and ordinary. He remembered evenings when he would return home late from business meetings, expecting silence, and finding Olivia in the same place she always tried to create warmth for him. There were dinners she had prepared that cooled slowly on the table while he handled urgent calls, emails, and negotiations that he told himself could not wait. At the time, he believed that building success required sacrifice from both of them, but he never questioned who was doing most of the waiting. He recalled one evening in particular when Olivia had placed a sketchbook on the coffee table and asked him, almost hesitantly, to look at a project she had been developing. He had glanced at it briefly while responding to a message on his phone, offering a distracted acknowledgement without truly seeing what she had created. That moment now resurfaced with uncomfortable clarity, not because it was dramatic, but because it had been so ordinary. Across the rooftop, Ethan introduced Olivia to another group of executives, and the way they responded to her name carried immediate recognition, as if she was already part of their internal language. Daniel noticed how no one corrected her, no one questioned her presence, and no one spoke to her as if she needed to prove anything. Instead, they listened, as if she was already a reference point in decisions that shaped outcomes beyond this single evening. A junior associate approached Daniel to discuss a pending agreement, but Daniel's responses were mechanical, his attention divided between the conversation in front of him and the realization unfolding across the room. Olivia's transformation was not marked by a single event that he could identify or dismiss. It was embedded in countless moments he had not prioritized, opportunities he had not recognized, and conversations he had not fully joined. He saw her now not as someone who had suddenly changed, but as someone who had been consistently evolving in spaces he had never entered with her. When Olivia spoke again during the investor discussion, her voice carried a measured authority that shaped the direction of the dialogue without effort. Daniel understood then that the distance between who they were now was not created by time alone, but by attention, by presence, and by the quiet consequences of not truly seeing someone while they were still standing beside you. The rooftop gala had settled into a controlled flow of conversations and strategic introductions, yet Daniel Reed remained trapped in a quiet internal collapse as he continued to observe Olivia Carter moving through the space with a level of assurance that felt entirely detached from the woman he once believed he knew. Ethan Whitmore stood close enough to her to signal alignment, but not possession, and that distinction unsettled Daniel more than anything else he had witnessed that evening. There was a structured ease in the way Olivia engaged with investors, as if she was not entering their world but confirming her place within it. Daniel noticed how people stopped explaining things to her mid-sentence, how they adjusted their language to match her responses instead of simplifying their ideas for her understanding. It was a reversal he could not ignore. He tried to anchor himself in something familiar, scanning faces he recognized from past industry events. But even those familiar reference points felt distant now, as if they belonged to a version of him that had not yet seen this version of the night. His thoughts drifted again, not in fragments this time, but in a continuous thread that pulled him backward into the quiet structure of their former life. He remembered mornings when Olivia would prepare breakfast without being asked, placing coffee beside his laptop in silence, as if care could exist without acknowledgement. At the time, he accepted it without reflection, assuming that stability required no verbal recognition, only presence. He also remembered how she had begun to spend more time outside the house in the final year, taking walks alone, returning with small changes in expression he had not asked about. He had interpreted those changes as harmless distance, something temporary, something that would resolve itself once his schedule stabilized. But stability had always been something he postponed into the future. Across the rooftop, Ethan introduced Olivia to a group of international partners, and the tone of their interaction shifted again, not toward admiration but toward recognition of authority already established. Daniel realized that no one was discovering her tonight. They were confirming her. A senior executive leaned in to ask her opinion on a pending acquisition strategy, and Olivia responded with a calm precision that redirected the conversation without effort. Daniel felt an unfamiliar discomfort rising, not from jealousy, but from the realization that he had never been part of the environment where she had developed this level of clarity. He recalled a night years earlier when she had tried to discuss ideas about creative direction and digital branding, speaking with quiet enthusiasm while showing him rough concepts she had developed. He had nodded absent-mindedly, still focused on a contract he was reviewing, promising to revisit the conversation later. That later never came in any meaningful way. Now those same ideas seemed to have matured into frameworks being discussed in rooms he had never entered. As the investors continued their conversation, Olivia remained composed, her responses brief but decisive, each one carrying the weight of experience that Daniel had not witnessed in real time. Ethan occasionally turned to her, not to confirm her statements, but to extend them, as if her perspective was already integrated into decisions being made at a higher level. Daniel finally understood that what he was witnessing was not a transformation that had happened recently, but a progression that had been uninterrupted by his absence. The realization settled quietly but firmly within him, that the life he assumed was paused while he was away had in fact continued forward without hesitation, and he had simply not been part of its movement. The rooftop gala had fully transitioned into its second wave of conversations, where deals were no longer being introduced, but quietly shaped through tone, timing, and recognition of power that did not need explanation. Yet Daniel Reed remained anchored in a stillness that contrasted sharply with the movement around him as he continued to observe Olivia Carter standing beside Ethan Whitmore. There was a change in the way people approached her now, no longer with curiosity or polite curiosity disguised as professionalism, but with a careful respect that suggested prior knowledge of her influence. Daniel noticed how conversations paused slightly when she entered them, not out of surprise, but out of recalibration, as if the room itself adjusted its expectations to match her presence. Ethan Whitmore did not introduce her as someone new to be evaluated, but as someone already integrated into decisions that mattered beyond this single evening. And that subtle difference continued to unsettle Daniel more than any direct confrontation could have. He found himself replaying fragments of their past with increasing clarity, not dramatic moments, but the quiet structure of everyday life that had once felt ordinary. He remembered Olivia sitting at the dining table early in the morning, reviewing notes she had written in careful handwriting, asking him once if he thought creative industries would shift toward digital immersion experiences in the next decade. He had answered without real engagement, his attention divided between a business report and a scheduled call, offering a vague agreement that ended the conversation rather than extending it. At the time, he had believed those exchanges were secondary to what he considered urgent responsibilities, but now he saw them as missed intersections where her thinking had been evolving without his participation. Across the rooftop, Olivia engaged in conversation with a group of investors discussing global expansion into European markets, and her responses were measured, precise, and structurally aligned with the language of leadership rather than support. Daniel noticed how she no longer waited for validation after speaking, how silence did not signal uncertainty but completion. Ethan occasionally stepped aside slightly, allowing her voice to carry without interruption, a gesture that felt intentional rather than habitual, as if her position did not require reinforcement. Daniel felt a growing realization that what he was witnessing was not an emergence of new confidence, but a fully formed identity operating in an environment that already recognized it. He recalled a period in their marriage when Olivia had begun attending small professional workshops during the day, returning home with subtle shifts in perspective, mentioning ideas about branding strategy and creative direction that she had started to explore independently. He had encouraged it casually without much attention, assuming it was a temporary interest rather than a developing trajectory. That assumption now felt like a blind spot that had quietly expanded over time. A senior investor asked Olivia directly for her perspective on a potential partnership structure, and she responded with a level of clarity that immediately influenced the direction of the discussion. There was no hesitation in her tone, no search for approval, only articulation of insight shaped by experience Daniel had never witnessed. As the conversation continued around her, Daniel understood with increasing certainty that he was no longer observing someone who had changed after leaving his life, but someone who had continued to grow in parallel to a world he had stopped sharing with her. And that recognition carried a quiet finality that no words on the rooftop could undo. The rooftop gala had reached a point where conversations no longer felt like introductions, but like confirmations of power already established. And Daniel Reed stood at the edge of it all, quietly observing Olivia Carter as she continued moving through the space beside Ethan Whitmore, with a composure that seemed untouched by the chaos of realization unfolding inside him. There was a shift now that even Daniel could not ignore, not in what Olivia said, but in how every room she entered seemed to reorganize itself around her presence. Executives who once spoke over each other now waited for her response before continuing, and even the most experienced investors adjusted their language mid-sentence when she offered a perspective that redirected the conversation with precision. Daniel noticed how Ethan Whitmore did not overshadow her, nor did he amplify her unnecessarily. Instead, he created space around her words as if her authority did not require reinforcement. It was a dynamic Daniel could not recall ever having with her, not because it was impossible, but because he had never been aware enough to build it. His memory continued to surface in fragments that no longer felt distant, but uncomfortably immediate, like they had been preserved in detail for this exact moment of recognition. He remembered Olivia once asking him about the future of creative branding in global markets, not as a passing question, but as a genuine exploration of ideas she was beginning to form. He had responded without depth, offering surface-level agreement while mentally moving on to other obligations he considered more urgent. At the time, he assumed those conversations were optional, something secondary to the structure of their shared life. Now he understood they had been foundational for her, even if he had never treated them that way. Across the rooftop, Olivia was now engaged in a structured discussion with senior partners about expansion strategies in Asia and Europe, and her contributions were not framed as suggestions, but as directional input. Daniel noticed how no one asked her to elaborate unnecessarily, because what she said already carried completeness. There was no search for approval in her tone, no hesitation that invited correction, only clarity shaped by experience that felt both distant and decisive. Ethan occasionally acknowledged her input with a slight nod, not as validation but as alignment, and that distinction made Daniel realize how far removed he had become from any version of her present life. He recalled the gradual changes in their final year together, moments he had dismissed as routine evolution rather than meaningful divergence. Olivia had begun attending professional seminars, returning home with ideas about design systems and digital storytelling that she had tried to share in passing. He had acknowledged them briefly while multitasking, never realizing that those ideas were not isolated thoughts, but part of a growing trajectory that was continuing beyond his attention. The realization now settled in him that nothing about her current presence had appeared suddenly. It had simply continued without interruption while his awareness remained elsewhere. As a senior investor asked Olivia for clarification on a strategic partnership model, she responded with a structured explanation that immediately influenced the direction of the discussion, shifting priorities without effort. Daniel stood still as he processed the absence of surprise in her voice, because what he was witnessing was not discovery, but continuation. For the first time that evening, he understood that the version of Olivia he had once known had not been replaced. It had simply evolved in a direction he had never once taken the time to follow. The rooftop gala had reached a point of quiet conclusion, not in the sense that the evening had ended, but in the sense that every remaining interaction now felt like a reflection of what had already been revealed, and Daniel Reed stood among the final clusters of guests with the uncomfortable awareness that nothing about the world he once understood remained unchanged. Olivia Carter was still there beside Ethan Whitmore, yet the way she occupied space now carried a finality that Daniel could not ignore. Conversations no longer circled around her for validation or curiosity. They returned to her, as if she was the reference point from which decisions were measured. Daniel watched as a final round of executives approached them, this time not to introduce themselves, but to confirm alignment on previously discussed terms. Olivia listened, then responded with a brief, structured summary that clarified direction, and the group nodded in agreement without hesitation. There was no negotiation in her presence anymore, only acknowledgement. Ethan Whitmore stepped slightly aside as she spoke, allowing her words to define the outcome of the discussion, and that simple act carried more authority than any statement Daniel had witnessed that night. It was then that Daniel felt the full weight of what had been forming throughout the evening, not as an emotional realization, but as a structural one. He had not simply lost access to her life. He had never been positioned within the environment where her life had continued to develop. His memory drifted again, not to dramatic turning points, but to the accumulation of overlooked moments that now formed a continuous line he could not separate. He remembered Olivia once leaving a printed proposal on his desk, asking him to review it when he had time. It had been a concept for a digital creative platform, something she had been quietly developing over months. He had placed it aside, intending to return later, but later had dissolved into other priorities. That pattern, repeated across years, now revealed itself not as neglect and isolation, but as a consistent absence of presence. Across the rooftop, the final conversation between Olivia, Ethan, and the investors concluded with a clear agreement, and there was no celebration, only completion. Olivia gave a small nod, not of satisfaction, but of acknowledgement, as if this outcome had already been accounted for long before it was spoken aloud. Daniel noticed how she no longer looked for reactions in the room, because reactions were no longer necessary for her understanding of her own position. When Ethan turned slightly toward her and spoke a brief sentence, Olivia responded with a quiet affirmation, and together they began to move toward the exit path of the rooftop venue. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, and unaccompanied by attention-seeking presence. Daniel found himself taking a step forward without intention, but stopped before closing the distance, aware that nothing he could say would intersect with the version of reality she was now operating within. As Olivia reached the edge of the exit, she paused for a moment, not to look back at the room, but to adjust her direction forward. And in that brief stillness, Daniel understood the final clarity of the evening. She had not risen in opposition to his absence, nor had she rebuilt herself in response to him. She had simply continued forward in a life that had never stopped moving. And as she disappeared from view beside Ethan Whitmore, Daniel remained standing in a room that no longer contained any version of her past, only the irreversible certainty that he had once stood beside someone he never truly learned how to see.